Everybody. As I am German, we're going to start 1 minute early. Hello and welcome everybody to today's side event, No Jobs on a Dead Planet. What does a just transition mean post-Paris? I'm really happy that you're all here today. Thanks for coming. I also heard that we have a couple of ministers attending this meeting from Zimbabwe and Poland and probably from other countries as well. We really As I said already, welcome to this year's UNFCCC official site event on just transition. In the Paris Agreement, thanks to trade unions and therefore made part or became part of a legally binding agreement to save the world's climate. This, and you all know that, was an extremely important step. Trade unions have been fighting for a just transition for years, making sure that workers will not be at the losing end of transformation processes, and also making sure that their rights are always respected. It is important to note at the same time that the concept of just transition is not only a topic for trade unions, it is a topic for everybody, as it is at the heart of fighting for more social justice. We as FES are very happy to support trade unions in their struggle for more social justice, as this concept is also at the core of what we do and what we're trying to achieve. We have a wonderful panel today, but before everyone on the panel can introduce him or herself, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Labid from UGTM, who is the focal point of UGTM and will speak on the behalf of the host country of Morocco. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy this side event. The Moroccan Union, sorry.
Mesdames, Messieurs, chers collègues, bonjour. Les syndicats marocains, en tant que syndicats du pays hôte de la COP de Marrakech, sont heureux de vous accueillir tous à ce side event. Étant membre de la Confédération syndicale internationale CSI, nous sommes fiers de faire partie du mouvement mondial de travailleurs. La désertification croissante, les super tempêtes, le rétrécissement des forêts et des lieux de travail, ainsi que les industries qui ont besoin d'être transformées en urgence, sont en première ligne du changement climatique. Il n'y a pas d'emploi sur une planète morte. Nous devons sauver la planète, développer les emplois, organiser les travailleurs, et je vous remercie.
Just for translation, we, the Moroccan trade unions, are pleased to receive you at this event by the ITUC, and we are proud of being involved in this particular event, but also involved in the efforts to fight climate change, fight and to prepare for the growing deserts and storms and climatic events. There are no jobs on a dead planet. Thank you for coming.
Sorry, no microphone. It just doesn't need a green light. My apologies. Welcome, IREPARATION, the global movement of trade unions and workers, representing workers in 165 countries around the world. I acknowledge and recognize many of my colleagues from the union movement here in the room, and for all of those who are not members of trade unions, you know you can always join, right? Our event here today is really an acknowledgement that we know we urgently need action to address climate change. That action that is required needs to be fast and fair and deep. That action is needed in all countries. We need to ensure that the transition that is already happening today does not leave workers and communities behind. Globally, in all countries, we have a crisis of climate and a crisis of inequality. This is leaving many people disenfranchised. As trade unions, we are committed to fighting for economic and social and environmental justice. That's why we've participated in the climate negotiations for many years. But in fact, the just transition is not just a language or a mantra for us. The just transition is about the economic planning and diversification and transition that has happened throughout human history. But what we know is that in that human history, it's not delivered fairness. It's not delivered justice. In the past, we've seen workers stranded and communities stranded. So the urgent action that is needed on climate is also needed to rebuild our economies and our societies, to be fairer and to be more inclusive. So the just transition is about job creation, absolutely. It's also about economic diversification. The just transition is about achieving those changes in our energy system to be low carbon. It's also about investment in community renewal. A just transition requires respect for workers' rights, for women's rights, for human rights. And it will take dialogue and planning to make it happen. It will also take new commitments for social support, including the social protection systems of all of our countries. And thereby, it requires a new kind of cooperative action and a new kind of solidarity. If we don't have a transition that is just, we face more political instability, more conflict, and I'm talking about in local communities and at national and global levels. A zero carbon, zero poverty future is a world that is within our reach, but it will require companies and industries, sectoral and economic transformation on a scale and at a speed faster than any in human history. A just transition brings together workers, communities, employers, government in a process of social dialogue to drive those very concrete plans that we need, to drive those investments that we need, and to drive those policies that we need. So whilst the just transition focuses on jobs, on livelihoods, and ensuring that no one is left behind, as we race to reduce emissions, to protect the climate, and to advance economic and social justice. The sad truth is that the transition we've seen in many countries in the past when it comes to economic change has often resulted in a heavy cost to workers and to communities, in high unemployment, sometimes intergenerational unemployment, with few options for workers. Our experience shows that the alternative economic thinking and the economic plans have not been well developed or put in place in time. This is a time-sensitive matter, friends. If we don't do the planning now, we face more chaos. We face more economic and environmental crises. So last year, 2015, was a very key year. Not only did we have the Paris Agreement, where the just transition is acknowledged as an imperative in addressing decent work and the impact of climate on workers and the role of workers in addressing climate action. As you know, 2015 was an important year in terms of agreeing on the Sustainable Development Goals. And there in Goal 8, we have recognition of decent work and full employment, encompassing the principles of a just transition. And we also have the development by those members of the ILO, of the International Labour Organization, governments, trade unions, and national employers who negotiated a set of guidelines that provides just transition guidelines for every country to be applied as a guide on how we actually achieve a just transition. They're really important, fundamental tool for all of us to use, no matter which country we come from and what level of development our economy has. So trade unions are actually doing a lot to forward a just transition. We have many here in these negotiations. May I ask you, if you're a member of the trade union delegation, to just raise your hand? A number in the room here from many different countries. Thank you for being here today. These are the people who are negotiating with companies in their workplaces, in their industries, and with their governments about having a just transition become real. We have it acknowledged in the Paris Agreement, and since then, and in the months and years ahead, it is our job to make that real. We are having already a number of industry-wide planning processes, city-wide planning processes, national policies recognizing the dialogue that is necessary for the energy and industry transformation. And here in Marrakesh, we have real expectations about the global governance of a just transition. For a sound global climate regime, that is a critical part of the solutions. We need the regulations and the timelines and the shared objectives and the common rules. These are essential for fairness, ensuring that the most vulnerable are protected. So we expect those commitments to be forwarded in the next week before we all leave Marrakesh. And from the perspective of the global unions, we have established a Just Transition Center to be working with companies and sectors, industry sectors, and governments at a municipal, provincial, or regional and national level, as well as with investors, with civil society organizations, and our friends in the communities, to really make concrete examples, to document those and to share those good practices. So what we try to do in the union movement is really build a dialogue for a just transition. And we're glad that you're here, a part of that conversation today. So now I would like to hand to my great colleague, Rhoda, from the International Trade Union Confederation Africa, to be our next speaker. Rhoda.
Thank you very much, Alison, for such a detailed and comprehensive introduction and overview to the just transition concept and principle, which is at the heart of our demands and actually what we as trade unions stand for and what we are advocating as workers in the transition towards a low carbon economy. I speak on behalf of the African Trade Union Confederation, representing 16 million workers around 51 African countries. And I would just like to touch briefly on the African perspective on climate change action, but also trying to draw a link to sustainable development, whilst also bringing out the need for just transition and where we stand or where we are currently in Africa. We all know that Africa, being a low net emitter when it comes to greenhouse gases, is actually the most vulnerable when it comes to climate change impacts. And therefore, there's the need for Africa to be at the heart of the discussions and dialogue that's taking place and as we try to find ways or seek ways in trying to address the current ecological crisis. At the same time, we also know that even though the continent is most at risk, workers particularly face or stand or are threatened the most for specific reasons, being that, one, Africa actually has a very large informal sector where already there are not really where rights are actually not really in place, and so Africa being a continent that's already threatened has more work to do when it comes to ensuring that the transition process is really just and ensures that no workers or the most vulnerable are protected, in that rights are protected, in that there is participation, but then most importantly, that there is decent work provisions. As background, it's probably good to give a brief introduction, in that we all know that Africa over the past years has recorded remarkable growth when it comes to economic growth, with most countries recording very high rates of GDP, with an average of 5.6% of GDP growth. However, this growth has not really translated into jobs. And so therefore, the continent is one continent that actually faces or has a very huge bulge of unemployed people, with the majority being young people. There is therefore the need for us to critically look at job creation, but then essentially also to look at how we can create, more importantly, decent work in the transition. We also need to touch on the fact that climate change, as we know, definitely is affecting jobs, and most jobs either may be transformed, most jobs may probably be eliminated depending on the sectors. And here we speak about jobs that are in the extractive industry. But then at the same time, we know that some jobs would be substituted. But the opportunity that we see here is that there stands the chance for jobs and several jobs to be created if the right policies are put in place. And this is where we see the opportunity for Africa, that we are asking that whilst we are transitioning, we need to see the opportunities in that we stand a chance to creating or leapfrogging into creating jobs that are more decent as we try to transition towards a green or low carbon economy. The dilemma, however, is how do we, as a continent that is not as developed, transition to a low carbon economy whilst also attending to our developmental needs, which is essentially what we need to do. And so the question of trying to draw a link between, or trying to ensure that our transition, our developmental process does not or follows a sustainable path, is what is essentially key for us as a continent. More specifically into workers and what it looks like in specific sectors, we know that the majority or the largest part of the African continent or population is found in the agricultural sector. Work is found in the agricultural sector. At the same time, we also know that this sector is one sector that is highly threatened when it comes to climate, mainly due to the changing patterns of the weather. Taking an example of the transportation sector, we also know that there is the need for us to transform or to transform the sector. And we have several initiatives that are taking place in this sector in specific African countries. Example would be the bus rapid transport system, which is being introduced in most countries, which is actually, on the one hand, a very good initiative. But then at the same time, we realize that there is also a trade-off where you look at the typical example being an example of my country, which is Ghana, where you find that there are a lot of local bus drivers who are mainly unionized and actually form a very big union within the Ghana Trades Union Congress. However, the introduction of the bus rapid transport system, which is supposed to be a response measure to or a good initiative when it comes to climate response, actually has a negative impact on these workers who stand the risk of losing their jobs at the expense of the introduction of the bus rapid system. Therefore, there's the need for us to look at how to put in place policies that would ensure that a typical example given, such as the example of the transportation system, workers would be carried on board or be taken along. And here, this is what we are saying, that the just transition principle is very important. The rights of these workers have to be taken into account, and there has to be in place social systems that would support some workers that may, on the one hand, have to lose their jobs and may not be able to be carried on board. We're also asking, most importantly, for us as Africa, that there should be social dialogue enforced in these processes, where we need to have all partners on board in these discussions. And so there's a need for workers to be at the table during the implementation of policies, and not only be brought on board at the end of policy implementation. And so even though there may be, or we realize that there may be some good initiatives when it comes to climate action in Africa, there is not really translation of these actions into policy. And this is one area where, as a continent, we need to put in a bit more work to try to develop policy frameworks around just transition to make sure that the transition process is favorable for workers and communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhoda. And now we Union. Brian, welcome.
Yeah. Okay, I was going to use the podium, but apparently the remote control for the for the presentation doesn't work, so I'll do it from here. IndustriALL Global Union, for those of you that don't know, we are a federation of trade unions globally in the industrial and private sector. We represent approximately 50 million workers globally in a number of industries. Okay, so they say this will work now. Good. We represent. Yeah. Microphone. Yeah. Thank you. We represent workers in industrial sectors, about 50 million workers globally in 140 countries, something like 700 affiliates. And we are the largest association of private sector unions, manufacturing, resource, production, and associated unions in the world. Not as big as ITUC, but we have a specific sectoral interest. Now, just transition is a concept that we have been one of the pioneers in. If you want to trace the genealogy of just transition, you could go back to the late, great Tony Mazzocchi in the United States in the late 1980s. That was adopted early by one of the predecessors of the present Unifor in Canada at a policy convention in the early 1990s, the first union in the world to do so. It was then taken up by other unions in Canada and the CLC, and finally the global trade union movement. So I'm proud to have played a role in getting Just Transition to be the umbrella under which we talk about the social issues necessary to manage a transformation. It's really the centerpiece of what we want. There is no other acceptable option. we can't accept a just transition to an unsustainable future, and we can't accept an unjust transition to an environmentally sustainable future. We must have both. Now, obviously, for the industrial sectors that IndustriALL represents, the Paris Agreement poses certain challenges, and we accept those challenges. We took it on in a matter of a policy paper, which I helped write with a number of other people, where we analyzed our industrial sectors and tried to look at what the impact of the Paris Agreement would be on it. And I'll just give you a flavor of it here. First of all, we defined sustainability according to our initiative, the economic dimension, the environmental dimension, and the social dimension, and what that means to us as trade unionists. And then we looked at each sector individually and said, well, what will this do in this sector? And I won't go through the whole report, but for example, we looked at the basic social, environmental, and economic challenges for each sector. And then we did a SWOT analysis for each sector. And we did this for all of our sectors: automotive, base metals, chemicals, energy, information communications technology and electronics, materials including glass, ceramics, and cement, mechanical engineering, and mining, pulp, paper, packaging, and forestry, rubber, shipbuilding and shipbreaking, textiles, garments, and tanning. And we looked at all of these in that manner. We've got a very large document as a result because of the number of sectors involved. You can find it on our webpage. I'll show the webpage later. As Kumi Nado, the International Executive Director of Greenpeace, said, the wheel of climate action turns slowly, but in Paris it turned. A deal that frustrates and disappoints me, but it still puts fossil fuels squarely on the wrong side of history. We're not sure that fossil fuels are going to disappear that quickly, but it will become increasingly difficult for investors and insurers to justify putting their money into fossil fuels, and it will change. Now, the question then is, as the private sector likes to tell us, can we rely on green jobs and the so-called free market to build a just transition to a sustainable future? Well, based on everything we know, that's pretty questionable. The deregulated free market has created the environmental crisis that we face and hasn't been particularly good at creating jobs, certainly not decent jobs. The economic crisis, broken social contracts, broken promises on technology transfer to developing countries, the whole question of trade barriers. The real objective of trade deals does not seem to be to aid development, but rather to create dependent clients. Overall, we would describe this as a lack of a sustainable industrial strategy. And you can't get to a sustainable future without a sustainable strategy, and it has to be a deliberate choice. It can't be left to chance. It cannot be left to the free market. So what are the components of a just transition? Well, we say there are three principal components. One is sustainable industrial policy, and that is a plan to encourage desired patterns of industrial development and growth along sustainable pathways. The second component is robust social protections, because you cannot guarantee a just transition unless you have a decent level of social protections in society. And I'm talking about healthcare, pensions, education, and all of the social safety nets that are fundamental to a decent society, including anything that guarantees human rights and labor rights, of course. And finally, creative labor adjustment. And what I mean by that is something different than what has been described as labor adjustment policies of the past, which have typically been top down and have not taken any account of what workers wanted or needed. So you get catastrophes like the Canadian government a couple of decades ago attempting to retrain fishermen in Newfoundland to be computer programmers. This is not a particularly useful form of labor adjustment. We're talking about something that actually reaches out to the needs and desires of the workers that are affected. So that's what we mean by sustainable industrial policy. We have a booklet on this. I have a number of copies of it with me for those of you that would like to take one with you in English and in French. And overall, we find on our webpage, www.industrialunion.org, you can find that large analysis report that I mentioned, as well as these, and download them and read them at your pleasure, or if you have a problem with insomnia. But really, this cartoon says it all. I mean, a lot of people would like to frame the labor movement as being, caught in the position of jobs versus the environment. But really, it must be both, or it will be neither. And thanks very much.
Brian, thank you. A just transition, but indeed many people across the environmental movement at a local, national and a global level have been engaged in fighting for and making real just transition measures. I now have the pleasure to introduce Asad Rahman from Friends of the Earth International. Thanks for being with us, Asad.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Alison, and sisters, brothers, friends, comrades. First of all, thank you to the ITUC for the kind invitation to join. Hope I can match their wisdom. I represent Friends of the Earth International, the world's largest grassroots environmental justice federation, representing millions of members and supporters in 75 countries, mainly in the global south. Our vision of a world where every citizen has a right to a dignified life and where we live within our planetary limits is fundamentally a struggle for equality and justice. And our only hope to be able to achieve that rests on the power of people, of organized people, and in the principles of solidarity. The slogan of Friends of the Earth International is resist, mobilize, and transform, which echoes the same values, principles, and beliefs of the trade union movement. So I was asked to say a few words about the climate crisis that faces us. Firstly, this is, of course, not just an environmental crisis. It's a crisis of injustice that says poor and black lives don't matter. It's a crisis of a broken economic system that has put profit before people and our planet. And ultimately, it's a crisis of empathy, justice, and humanity. Climate change, as we all know, is the crisis of all crises. It fans the flames of every existing inequality and injustice in the world. Conflict, forced migration, gender and racial injustice, hunger, economic inequality, extreme weather, systems collapse, you name it, climate change has its fingerprints on them all. Last year, as we know, saw the hottest global temperatures since records began, and 2016 has already broken that record. Temperatures are now hotter than they have been for 115,000 years. And we know that raising temperatures by just 1 degree centigrade has been enough to melt half the summer ice in the Arctic, kill off huge swathes of the world's corals, and unleash lethal floods and droughts. And of course, high temperatures mean more extreme weathers. I'm originally from Pakistan, and this year we had a heat wave which hit 53 degrees centigrade. That's literally at the upper end of what a human being can tolerate in the outdoors. And the response of our government was to begin to dig mass graves. Because last year, a similar heat wave killed 1,200 people in one city. And this is a country where in 1210, speak a little slower for the term. Sorry, I'm in my northern, trying to get as many words in as possible. So last year,
Slow down.
I will.
It's just for the interpreter.
I know, I'm sorry.
We know it's urgent.
I know.
Slow down.
It's more that I've got a lot to say. Last year, a similar heat wave killed 1,200 people in one city. And in 2010, we had one flood in Pakistan, which affected 20 million people and caused $43 billion worth of damage. And this is a country where 4 out of 10 people face multiple dimensional poverty, and where one shock can push those who are barely surviving into not surviving. And of course, we all know about the drought that's happening in the sub-Saharan Africa, in the Sahel, which has affected 23 million people and displaced 3.5 million people, or the typhoon that happened during one of these climate negotiations in 2013, which left 7,000 dead and 2 million people homeless. And just a note that only 1% of the homes have been rebuilt of those people who were left homeless. Slow. Even when there isn't a huge loss of life, such as the tropical storm Erica, which hit the Caribbean island of Dominica in 2015. That one single storm managed to wipe out 20 years of development gains. And the list, of course, is endless. And there are various estimates, and one puts that we're losing about 700,000 of our fellow citizens each year to the impacts of climate change, with, of course, millions more losing their homes and their livelihoods. Even the most optimistic projections, and you may have seen the recent UNEP report, which was released last Thursday, based on the pledges in the climate agreement in Paris last year, have temperatures heading towards at least 3 degrees warming above industrial levels. That's why social movements from the global south, Friends of the Earth, labor movements, climate scientists, and governments representing the poorest and most vulnerable, all demanded that temperature increases be kept well below 1.5 to prevent those tipping points. A call during Paris was 1.5 to barely stay alive. And there's an analogy that you often hear in these corridors, that we're all on the Titanic and it's hit the proverbial climate iceberg and the Titanic continues to plow forward. And whilst it's absolutely right that climate change ultimately affects us all, the reality is, of course, it's that the rich are on the deck of the Titanic, sipping cocktails, listening to the orchestra play, and hoping for some miracle technological answer is going to save them. And the truth is that in the hold, it's the poor, the most marginalized, the people in the global north, and Black, brown, indigenous people in developing countries who are already drowning. And when they try and escape, they find that the doors to the hold are locked shut. That's why we as Friends of the Earth fundamentally believe that climate change is not just an issue of environmental injustice, it's of racial and economic injustice as well. And we know that the greatest injustice is that those least responsible are the first to be affected. There was a recent analysis which showed that 10% of the world's population are responsible for 50% of global emissions, and the poorest 50% are responsible for only 10% of emissions. And that's why equity is such a fundamental concept in these negotiations and how we tackle climate change, that those most responsible for causing the crisis and who have benefited the most have to take the lead and have to provide the support needed for people to be able to, countries to grow cleanly, but also to be able to tackle the huge inequalities and poverty that blight the lives of so many of our fellow citizens. And we know the figures. In average, in the United States, with just 5% of the world's population, a person there has a per capita income of $55,000 and emits about above 16 tons of CO2 a year, whilst the poorest countries, overwhelmingly in Africa, which constitute about 11% of the world's population, have a per capita income of just above $1,400 and emit less than a ton of CO2 per year. And just another truth in these negotiations is, there's a lot of policy assumptions that we're told by governments, and much of it is actually calculated to overshoot the amount of carbon pollution that we can emit to if we want to keep warming well below 1.5. In fact, most assumptions say they're going to emit 3 times the amount of budget needed for 1.5 and somehow suck 2/3 of that carbon back out of the atmosphere. As we all know, there is actually no available technology to do that. It's simply a cross your fingers and hope. The UNEP calculated there are only a few years left to meet that 1.5 guardrail and only a few more for 2 degrees. And we very much see this as a decade zero for people and for our planet. Because fundamentally, like austerity, climate change is a redistribution of right to life and dignity from the poor to the rich. Oh, damn, 1 minute. That's why I was trying to speak fast. Nicholas Stern said, as the renowned economist, he said about the economics of climate change, and he's not a man noted for making radical comments, and he called climate change the greatest failure of the free market system. Look, we know we need to change how we produce and consume our energy, and that for us means more than simply getting big business to ditch dirty energy for clean energy, or imposing solutions on communities and workers that don't have their support or engagement, things that are done to us without a consent, where we are made the sacrifice zone for the economic costs of that transition. We have to see energy as a social good, owned and controlled by people, local democratic control, local authorities, tenants groups, but workers' control as well, local citizens, yourself and myself. And this week in the UK, Friends of the Earth, together with the labour movement, are marking the 40th anniversary of when workers at Lucas Aerospace proposed a bottom-up industrial plan from factories making armaments. Not only a plan to save jobs, but a plan that was built on producing wind turbines 40 years ago, kidney dialysis machines and other socially useful goods. A just transition that was built with workers and by workers. So we had new jobs, clean jobs, good jobs, unionized jobs, but jobs that were also good for our economy and for our planet. And it clearly is happening all over again. And you see it all around the world, from unions, and not just health unions who are witnessing the climate impacts in reality, but actually unions on the front line of the extractive industry. If you bear with me, I want to just give one simple example. In Australia, there's a valley, the Latrobe Valley, which has 4 coal-fired power stations, generates about 85% of electricity in the state of Victoria. Over the last few years, Friends of the Earth have focused on getting alternative energy in that state. And so after a very successful campaign, the state government agreed to a state renewable energy target of 25% by 2020 and 40% by 2025, but also with a commitment to create 10,000 new jobs through to 2025. And that was our starting point, getting jobs and renewables before we took action in that valley. In 2016, we employed a grassroots campaigner directly to work in that valley, to work with local communities around public health, but also to focus on building connections, both with community groups and with the unions, on an economic diversification and transition. They outsourced ideas on that transition, they created a people's transition plan, and they used this document to lobby the state government to get substantial funds in the next 2 state budget. It's only now that we actually started to work on closing the Hazelwood mine, because our approach was first on transition, not demanding an immediate closure. We built that partnership with the local miners union, the CFMW, and the local Trades and Labour Council. So our approach is fundamentally different. It didn't simply focus on closure and then tack transition at the end, narratives at the end of it. It put just transition at the center of us tackling this forward. And we see this happening again and again in Scotland. Our Friends of the Earth group is working with the Unite the Union, the Health Workers Union, Unison, but also to oppose fracking. But we're also building a conference at the end of the year together with governments, unions and business to discuss how we transition out of North Sea oil. And in England, we're working with PCS, the union, and social justice groups to also develop a set of people's demands, which connect our struggles on austerity, climate, and creating a new economy. I want to just end by saying, look, over the last few days, I think we've all got a glimpse of the future ahead of us. It's a dystopian future of walls and fences, of where millions are going to be sacrificed to allow the few to be able to continue to consume, where the response to the climate crisis is likely to be led by warships, and where at the exact moment we need more solidarity, more justice, the world is retreat into right-wing popular nationalism and xenophobia. And to stop that, we really need to build a movement for transformational change. And so we can't be locked into our single issues. We have to be intersectional. We have to connect our local fights to our global fights, but we have to be rooted in justice and solidarity. And we have to recognize that fundamentally, this is a life and death struggle for power. And those with power don't give up theirs without a struggle. And that's why what connects us as the climate justice movement and the labor movement, because we both know that without organizing, without fighting, we never win. Thank you.
And today for all your words. We all have a lot we want to share. Before I hand to our next speaker, I want to just raise the point that unions all that has been said so far today. And those are to raise ambition and realize the job potential of climate action, to deliver on climate finance and support the most vulnerable, to commit to securing a just transition for workers and their communities. These demands are in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic on our website in this document. Just go to the ITUC website and look for Climate COP22. There are some copies of this document available. Friends can hand them out as you leave. I'm sorry, not enough for everybody. We're trying to go paper free, so go to the website. But indeed, what we are facing here in the negotiations is the role of government and unions and communities and business, all of us. I'm now going to hand to Tasneem Aesop, who is on the National Planning Commission of South Africa. She's a member of the South African delegation here. Tasneem, there's many challenges in South Africa, and there's many challenges at a municipal level, a provincial level, a national level for government action. There's also a long history of dialogue between unions and companies and government at all those levels in South Africa. Please share with us some of the experiences from your country. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Alison. I am quite cognizant of the time, so I'm hoping that I can speak faster. Just to put the National Planning Commission in context, this is an independent commission. It is not a government commission. The president of the country pulled together a group of 25 people who are experts, specialists in a range of areas that needed attention and focus for the development of a national plan. The National Development Plan of South Africa is not a government plan. It is a plan for the country. It is a long-term plan to 2030, and this independent planning commission, we're in an advisory role to government as well, was approved by the cabinet in South Africa. So I'm going to talk a bit about the chapter in the National Development Plan that focuses on the just transition to a low carbon, climate resilient economy and society. And this was a really interesting piece of work exactly because of the things you've heard from all the speakers on this panel here, the principles that need to guide such processes, the approaches, the complexities, all of these issues had to find its space in the way we engage to develop a plan on the just transition. So this presentation will look at the context of that National Development Plan very briefly, touch on the international and domestic context now, because this plan was produced in 2011 and much has changed since then. So we are in a process of re-looking at that. Then I'll touch on what the plan actually says about the low carbon transition, what the process was, some of the challenges, and what we're planning to do going forward. So when we developed the national plan, the development plan, we first started with a diagnostic, and this was an inclusive process. We went across the country as commissioners and we listened to the people. We had engagements with South Africans. And it's not like we needed to really do that to know these problems, but it was important to hear it from people. So our diagnostic was, of course, there's too few jobs in the country. We had crumbling infrastructure. The biggest diagnostic here for us and relevant to the chapter that I led was the issue of South Africa being a resource-intensive economy. And at the center of all of this was that South Africa is also, and it's not very different to many developing countries, we have high levels of poverty, and we're one of the most unequal countries in the world, one with the highest Gini, well, at the top of the highest Gini coefficients in the world. So moving from diagnostic to plan, we understood that we then needed to turn all of those problems into, and change them into the plan to address them. So this is very fancy and I'm going to get to it soon. There we go. So what we wanted was actually to build a prosperous country that with equity at its center. So to address, well, eradicate poverty and address inequality. And the issue about resource intensity was to actually use our resources sustainably. That's the piece that guided the chapter 5 of the plan itself. So since then, of course, as I said, the international context has changed. We now have the Paris Agreement. It's entered into force. South Africa, Parliament has ratified the agreement as well. So that's quite exciting just before the COP. We are going to be seeing an amazing report that will have to guide us as well quite strongly about how to achieve 1.5 degrees. We adopted Sustainable Development Goals last year, and we are witnessing amazing shifts in the energy market. I mean, this is not the purpose of this particular thing, but that's the kind of international context. And at the domestic level, we obviously have the National Climate Change Response Strategy, and our South African government, I'm sure, has been presenting that strategy. It's formed the basis of their INDC as well. And this INDC has been submitted with a peak, plateau, and decline approach for mitigation, and has a range of emission reduction potential. But this is what I thought we all needed to do. It sets the context, especially following from your side, that analysis has shown that the current INDC, so yes, we've adopted an agreement here. The Paris Agreement is entering into force. But the reality is that all the commitments made by all the governments actually still take us on a path between 3.5, depending on which analysis you look, to 3.5 to 6 in some instances of analysis. So that's our challenge. And how do we get down, and that, you know, beyond the 2-degree pathway to 1.5 means that this transition, this transformation is going to have to happen faster and deeper than we anticipated ever, which means planning for that transition is not a luxury any longer. In fact, we've already overtaken it. If we're not planning, we're too late, maybe. But of course, we are always optimistic, and so we can do things at a fast pace. So the vision in our plan in South Africa, and that's, I'm not going to read it, so don't worry about that. But essentially, we have this vision for 2030. The important elements of this, of course, is that we have put the reduction of poverty and unemployment as the center of the plan, and that also has to be at the center of how we plan for decarbonizing our economy and our society. If you're really interested, I'm sure if you Google the National Development Plan of South Africa and read Chapter 5, then the details of all of that, the vision and the approach is there. But I do want to talk about our experiences in actually dealing with this issue while developing the plan. As you can imagine, it's an extremely complex issue, and I don't think this is a phenomenon in South Africa alone. But when you have an economy that is largely dependent on coal, actually, for economic development, you know, to start planning to transition away from that is complicated. So we have high levels of CO2 emissions. We're not just, you know, we also contribute we're in the top 20. So while we're also going to be experiencing high levels of impacts in our country, and we already are, we're also contributing to global emissions in a very big way, and we have to be a good global citizen. Our economic development is, of course, very dependent on fossil fuels, with coal at the center. We have huge reserves of coal, and we export coal, so there's another issue that we have to discuss. We have, as I said, very high levels of poverty, unemployment, very high levels of unemployment, and especially amongst the youth. And as I said, we're one of the most unequal countries in the world. So when we looked at this, you know, how do we transition? How do we plan for this transition? It is absolutely clear in our plan and in our approach that eradicating poverty and reducing inequality has to be at the very center of that plan, that just transition planning. So the plan talks about how, you know, the kinds of elements we would have to look at: expanding the renewable energy program, what are the policy instruments that we need to do this, what kind of government actions need to be taken, and also in terms of transparent actions, better and effective regulation, and also robust M&E. But, you know, that still is just on paper. What we are doing in the national plan is adopting a carbon budget approach. Now, this is where things are going to get really exciting and challenging, because if we took, for example, the peak, plateau, and decline trajectory that South Africa has put in the INDC, there's a mid-range, a top range, and a bottom range. I prefer the bottom range because it's the most stringent and fair and necessary. But if you took the space below that trajectory, essentially you can quantify a carbon budget. That is the space that South Africa has. Now, this is the challenge in our conversations around the transformation. Beside, doing all the sector work like you're doing in the industrial unions, etc., you have to have a national picture, but also informed by a global picture. South Africa assumed this carbon budget for itself because there has not been a global carbon budget based on equity framed in any agreements up to now. That is a missing piece that we all need. But assuming this carbon budget, in South Africa, how do you share this budget? And that's how you plan for the transition. So can government decide on how to spend that budget alone? As commissioners, as in the Planning Commission, we believe it cannot be a government decision alone. That all our social partners have to be at the table, and the nation has to be part of these conversations. The nation, society as a whole. So right now, of course, there are discussions on how certain sectors will get carbon budgets for each sector, and even at the company level. The unions are not at the table in South Africa. The unions are not at the table. Not acceptable. Communities are not at the table. So who decides how that remaining carbon budget is spent? And we argue it cannot be government alone. In fact, it cannot be government and the private sector alone, because they're vested interests. So as we say, there's going to be winners and losers. That's the reality. We mustn't think that the just transition is going to be easy, that everybody's going to be win-win necessarily. When you're moving from a bad to a good, there are some of the bad that's going to lose. But there are people in the bad places that need to be protected, like workers who are working in sectors that have to shut down. So how do we deal with that? That cannot be a government decision, and it cannot be a private sector decision alone. So the other thing is, what are we going to be prioritizing in this time frame now? Are we going to talk about public good versus private interests? And right now, those negotiations with private companies, with sectors in our economy, are not going to take into account the public good. In South Africa, we have to eradicate poverty. So we have to invest in public good, whether it's going to be housing or public transport or whatever. That requires carbon space. So those are big key issues that we really have to factor in when we're planning and having the negotiations around a just transition, for a just transition.
1 minute.
1 minute. Challenges. I really think it's important, and some of these challenges have already come up, but for us to understand exactly, because it's complex, that there are many challenges. The big one is, of course, in many of our developing countries, and in South Africa particularly, development is still seen as something versus the environment. And that narrative, that paradigm, we've not managed to break, and we really have to do that. Climate change is not an environmental issue alone. It is fundamentally social. It is fundamentally about the economy and about rights. So that is the one thing that we still need to battle around. And I think all of us should be putting our heads together around that. There is clearly stakeholder vested interest. When I did the first round of conversations for the plan, we had business, labor, civil society, and government in a room. When they are together, it becomes a negotiation. So nobody's willing to rise up above their constituency interests and the interest of the country and the world. They're protecting their own vested interests. And the fascinating thing is, at least the one thing that unified the other social partners, business, labor, and civil society, was that they were all against the government, and they blamed the government for everything. So I think when you do your planning, you have to make sure that social partners understand that this is not about purely protecting their narrow vested constituency interests, but actually we're planning for the national good and the global good. Last point, of course, is the synergies. We have nice policies on paper, and then in implementation, government goes and builds huge infrastructure that will be locked into the future, like they're doing in South Africa. We're now looking at, still investing further in coal. There's nuclear on the agenda, etc. So we certainly have to discuss the trade-offs and the lockings early on. It needs to happen now. Okay, I'm not going to go through that, Alison.
Last point.
Yeah, I'll make, okay, my last point. But there's lots of unresolved issues. I think that the biggest point I want to make is that this, for a just transition to happen, it needs planning. but it needs to be inclusive and transparent. And it has to be a conversation, because this is big transformational things. It has to be a conversation that we all engaged in, that we all have the power to decide on. How we use remaining carbon space is critical for all of us. And so it cannot be closed room plans or academic modeling exercises. It is a fundamental conversation that needs to be had with our key social partners at the table, but with society as well. So that's the last point I want to make. But the final point I want to make is that I am so excited by your Australian model, because I think what we do at the Planning Commission is that it's the macro national level, but I do think you've just created a model for doing this in a bottom-up way as well. So I'm totally excited by this. I've learned a lot on this panel, and I want to thank ITUC for inviting me. Thank you very much.
Phones to you for your comments and questions. I just want to acknowledge the knowledge and the passion of our panelists. It would be great, Tasneem, to have such a passionate member as you are, a former provincial environment minister and a member of a planning commission at a national level,
And a
to
former
show,
trade unionist.
and a former in all of our negotiations. So I must also declare I'm a proud Australian, from which the example Assad gave, that has been 20 years in making, that example.
Yeah.
And I must tell you that the head of the Construction, Forestry, Mining and Energy Union, who is very much a part of that work, has been paid by his own members for 15 years to work on just transition, on work at the community level with his members and looking for alternative economic models for that community, which had no other option other than a coal power station. So it is a good news story, and the challenge is just in process. The challenge ahead is very large as well, even in a country with the resources of my country, of Australia. So now we have people with roving mics. I am going to chair, and I'm going to be really strict with you to ask you to limit your interventions to 2 to 3 minutes tops, so that as many people as possible can speak. I will indicate who is speaking, and then the microphone will come to you. So first of all, this lady here in green, please. Microphone. Please identify yourself and then make your intervention really sharp and to the point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Asidina Pwe from Education International, Africa region. Education International EI is a global union federation with 30 million members in 174 countries all over the world. We are the voice of education personnel. As you know, we were in Paris, and EI fully endorsed the demands of the international trade union movement. We believe at EI that education is a powerful tool for combating climate change and achieving just transition. Then EI recommends to COP22 and to government to 1, put education at the center of national, regional, and global efforts to combat climate change. In that regard, ensure the education would play a major role in moving forward the implementation of the Paris Agreement by calling all parties to include the issue of climate change in national education policies, plans, programs, and curricula. To consolidate the Paris Agreement by introducing or restoring references to adequate and predictive financial support for climate change education, training and research with an application across all parties, both developing and developed countries.
Madam, please bring your point, the last point.
Yes, the last point. Make sure that international climate governance enforces the UN Sustainable Development Goal and the UNESCO Global Action Program on Education for Sustainable Development. And finally, we want to adopt measures to strengthen initial teachers training and continuous professional development program in order to equip teachers and other educational professionals with the competencies needed to teach education to our children. Thank you.
Thank you. The microphone here in the front, please. I acknowledge the minister from Poland. And then we'll come to this side of the room.
Good afternoon. My name is Sajek. I'm from Poland. I am not minister. I'm deputy secretary in Ministry Environment of Poland. I would like to say thank you very much to invite me to this event, and it is a good idea. So we have a chance to exchange view about change climate. But I want to say my congratulations for you, Tassem, for your presentation, for your speech. But I agree with you, and I want to say so. I'm from Poland, and Poland have big sources of coal. And I would like to say about coal in the Poland. Of course, we protected the climate and thinking about protecting change climate. But for my country, for my society, coal is basic to energy security. Energy security is very important to my country, and I think so. We remember about energy mix, because energy mix is too very important, and of course workers and employees. It is industry to produce electricity and heat power station, and the fossil fuel digger sector. It's very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and my apologies, of course, Secretary of State for the Environment from Poland. Gentleman here in the second, yes. No, sorry, the man on the end, second row. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Nimo Bassi, Oil Watch International. Thank you for the presentations, really very deep. I just want to know what the panelists think about the challenge that we're facing in the planet generally, especially in Africa. What do you think about the need to define clearly a new vision of economy rather than playing catch up? What kind of development do we need? Do we have to follow a polluting, destructive model that can't operate really on a finite planet? Or should we radically think of something new and pull the world to save the planet to come on the way of alternative wisdom?
Thank you for your question. We are going to have the panelists respond as best after we take as many possible points. I recognize this, and not everyone is going to get to speak, right? This gentleman here.
Hello, my name is Tanja Müller from the German Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and the Disobedient Anti-Coal campaign Ende Gelände. In Germany, we are currently fighting for a coal phase out because we know that if we want to stick to the Paris Agreement, Germany, which is world leader in digging up and burning lignite, Germany would need to get out of coal by 2025. There are no realistic plans. We have sent researchers out into the world. Please look for plans for just transitions that could help us getting this done within 8, 9, 10 years. There are no plans. The only realistic plan we so far have for a just coal phase out in Germany would take us to 2040 as a date to get out of lignite. From a climate perspective, and therefore from a justice perspective, from a global justice perspective, it would be ludicrous if one of the most powerful and richest countries of the earth took 25 years to get out of coal. but a call for a just transition and making the coal phase out dependent on a just transition. That is currently my problem. I've been a socialist much longer than a climate justice activist. But my problem is, if I go for the global justice call, I need to get out of coal by 2025. If I go for the just transition call, it won't be earlier than 2040. So my question to the panelists, what the fuck do I do? No, I'm serious. This is currently a question we're facing.
We will come back. Let's give us time. The gentleman in the very back row. Thank you.
Hi, Jonas Helseth from the Bologna Foundation, environmental NGO in Europe. We've been working a lot with the European Trade Union Council over the last couple of years at the ITUC, and we're going to present some of our work later today at the Nordic Pavilion, 5:15. Now, last month I was at the annual event of the European Trade Union Council. They were presenting this report here, which is looking at industrial regions in Europe and just transition for those regions. And some of the things I heard at that event were quite, I would say, worrying, because there were a lot of people from trade unions in Europe who were worrying at some of the things that the environmental movement are saying in Europe. But it's a bit of a comment maybe to the colleague in Friends of the Earth as well, that, you know, first of all, that the environment movement isn't really looking at, and at times also fighting technologies that can help traditional industries, as we call them, steel, cement, and so on, with a way out, technologies like CO2 capture and storage. And that's something that I think is raising concern, because those industries are industries we need for the transition to a low carbon economy. Building windmills, you know, that takes steel, takes cement. Building low carbon houses, it needs cement. So all those things I think are raising concerns, and it's a bit of a challenge to Friends of the Earth and to other colleagues from the environment movement on how we can ensure that you know, we keep the unions in Europe as allies and friends, because I think if we don't, then climate ambition is a bit of a game over situation. Thank you.
Thank you. I now acknowledge the gentleman in the check shirt, please, holding the paper, please stand up, and then a lady over on this side.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, panelists. I'm really pleased with the presentation of this panel. It simply shows...
Please introduce yourself.
My name is Godwin Uji Ojo, Executive Director, Environmental Rights Action, Friends of the Earth, Nigeria. I'm really pleased with the presentation of these panelists. It simply shows that a just transition is possible. That is what I'm hearing. Brian, thank you for that presentation. When I was in your meeting in South Africa about 2 years back, and I presented to IndustriALL, leave the oil in the soil, there was an uproar in the room. Half of your group said, chase him away. He's coming to disturb us. The other group said, let us listen to him. Some of the things I said, you have presented, which is very good. I just want to underscore this transition that is going on in the labor union. Civil society in general used to see the labor as a lagging force of the just transition. They're not willing to engage. People are nudging and calling. The labor union is drawing back. And we need to understand that we are not saying that all labor should close down. We are saying it is time for a transition. In Nigeria, people are saying, oh, they were telling us, oh, leave oil in the soil is not possible. While we were having this debate on leave the oil in the soil. But today, even the Nigerian government is one of those discussing leave the oil in the soil. So I simply believe that a just transition is possible if labor will listen a little bit, and let us see how we can work to ensure that both labor and the environment attain a sustainable level. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize the lady here in the glasses and the gentleman in the front row. Second row. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Montserrat Mir from the European Trade Union Confederation. I don't know if I can answer the previous question, but what I can say is that as a European Trade Union Confederation, we are trying to push to convert the just transition in a reality. And we are working with the European Parliament, for example. We are encouraging the members of the Parliament to include the just transition clause in the through a just transition fund, because the answer is just transition needs to be funded, needs instruments to change those industries, and the just transition needs also to have the complicity of the workers, because we need to continue with the industry, but another kind of industry. We cannot let no one behind. For that reason, we are building this idea of the Just Transition Fund at the European level. Will be a very interesting tool to convert those industries in industries that can have good jobs and not in a long time, because that is not eternal. Thank you very much. And thank you for this event.
Thank you. So the lady here with her arm up, and then the gentleman here in the front row. And I'm afraid we're going to have to end the list there. There is so much more to speak about, but we will need to turn to the panel to make final comments to address your points. Please make it short.
Thank you. I'm Marjorie from Force Ouvrière, the union in France. We are very pleased to be here and to hear what the speakers had to say. We have to say that the COP22 is indeed the action COP. But FO is very worried that COP22 becomes a pretext to go backwards on what was agreed in Paris, even more with the recent election of the American president. COP21 was only a first step in taking into account the social matters. But for the moment, there are very few binding terms. And for FO, there are indeed no jobs on a dead planet. But there is no environmental progress without social progress. What is the point of having green jobs if the workers feel blue? Sorry. So this is why for FO, the link with the SDGs is really crucial, especially with the SDG 8 on decent work. And with decent work, we mean what the ILO means, that is to say social protection, decent wages, freedom of association, and collective bargaining. For FO, the Paris Agreement cannot become concrete without public investment, training and job transition, research and development, and the guarantee to maintain energy, which is a public good, under public management and control. And last point. So the ILO has produced guidelines. FO, Force Ouvrière, thinks that the ILO must play a crucial role and be a major actor of COPs. So you can understand that for FO, COP22 represents many challenges. So now, time for action.
Thank you. The gentleman here in the second row, you have the mic.
Oh, okay. I'm Alex Costa. I'm a climate scientist from Brazil. And I have two questions for the panelists. First of all is the issue of immigration. You know, the scientific evidences are very clear that even in modest warming of about 2 degrees Celsius, we are already talking about a sea level rise of about 6 to 13 meters. So that means a displacement of 100 million people in Bangladesh only. So how the working class movement, how the trade unions movement is addressing the issue of migration, in my point of view, we have to talk about open boundaries, open hearts, open arms to receive us all like brothers and sisters. The second question is, we are talking about few jobs, but at the same time, we're talking about too much consumption, too much production of bad goods. So how, in terms of the productivity of work we have now, we can address the issue of a campaign about reduction of working hours linked to the climate movement?
So friends, the challenge is for each of you as panelists to address the very deep and challenging questions put forward, to make your final comments, and to do it all in 10 minutes. I want to quickly say and add, because we don't have time to go on further, even though there is many serious issues to really address in a more deep way. This is happening with trade unions and other allies in most countries. But there is another event next Thursday on the 17th in which the European Trade Union Confederation and the International Labour Organization have a side event. I suggest you go to that event to take up this conversation further at 10:30 next Thursday. So Brian, I ask you to answer these deep questions as briefly and succinctly as possible. Then Assad, Tasneem, Rhoda, thank you.
Thank you. My answer is going to try to cover several questions, so you'll have to follow it if you can. My message is this: social outcomes can be predicted by the social policy choices adopted. This is quite clear. We need government policy choices to be public policy in the public interest. We haven't seen a lot of that lately. It's not a question of capacity, it's a question of priorities. And to the questioner from Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, who questioned whether the capacity exists, the capacity certainly exists. It's a question of priorities, and a rapid transition can be accomplished if adequate resources are dedicated to the creation of a just transition, and those resources exist. We are arguing here at this conference about a $100 billion climate fund, which sounds like a lot of money, and it is, but compare that to 4 to 5 trillion with a T that we spend annually on military and war, or 14 trillion with a T that was rounded up almost overnight to bail out the criminal banksters when they drove the global economy off a cliff in 2008 to 2009. Now those resources existed and were able to be mobilized instantly. And yet we spend years agonizing over a $100 billion fund to save life on Earth. Now that doesn't seem to me like we have our priorities particularly clear. And to the early questioner about the structural changes that may be needed, yes, we do need at some point to look at whether employment is the only or preferred choice for distributing wealth in society. But that, I think, is a conversation that can wait after we get a just transition in place to deal with the climate. Thank you.
So I think one of the biggest challenges we know generally from the way that the climate movement and this climate issue has been talked about, of course, is I think it's used the wrong frames for a long time. I mean, it's talked about things that didn't really connect with people. So we don't have the social license. We don't have the buy-in. We don't even have people who understand the sense of urgency. If our own governments and negotiators sitting in those rooms who know the climate science and know what's coming around aren't moved to the kind of common global push that's needed, liberating the amount of resources and support, and actually being able to go beyond the no to actually say, this is the vision, to be able to engage people positively in that positive vision, to say that it's actually a better world, a cleaner, more equal world, then I think you can start to look at that. So, you know, I think for us as Friends of the Earth, we've actually always tried and say, we are, yes, we have many no's, but we're also, we look for our yeses. And so I think the pace, speed, the values, principles, we have to recognize that the economic model has failed. And I lived through the miners' strike in the UK, and I was active in the miners' strike, and I know the devastation that created to local communities and how that scars all industrial sectors, which is why, you know, when the campaign for the British Steelworks was taking place, Friends of the Earth actually backed that campaign. But what we said was actually there should be investment in new technologies, in low carbon steel. That's the way to actually guarantee those jobs, not simply about keeping old industrial jobs. We actually have to work with unions by creating those things. Similarly, I think in terms of you talked about climate-induced migration. Well, actually, on February 11th, 2017, Friends of the Earth, together with the Fire Brigades Union, public sector unions, the Teachers Union, and the Black Trade Union Black Workers Group, are actually organizing a trade union and environmental conference on climate-induced migration and building a campaign collectively for protecting refugee and migrants in the UK and calling for safe passage and refugees welcome. I think that's the kind of model, because we share those same common values, and we know that we have to have a frame that understands that the climate crisis is happening, and we in the rich countries have a responsibility, both in terms of being able to provide safe haven, but also ensuring that we stop the things that we're doing which are causing the crisis, and those are multiple, as we know. So you know, to Tadjio, I don't say it is a choice. You know, you know, the climate imperative is what drives. I want Germany, which is one of the richest countries in the world, to say, I will guarantee the pensions. I will guarantee the salaries. I will invest in that area so that there is an alternative. So workers aren't afraid and unions aren't afraid that what they're giving up is good unionized, organized jobs for for zero contract hours or non-unionized jobs. We actually have to say there has to be a really political transition and not just this just transition on paper. Thank you. I hope I put my 2 minutes.
Yeah, thanks. I think that just in reply to, do we need a new economic model or a model of development? Absolutely. I mean, if that message did not come across, when we're saying there has to be massive transformation, it means massive transformation of our economy and our societies. Massive. So it cannot be the business as usual old model. Even the status quo is admitting that it's failed. So, I mean, what are we doing to still try and do that? So to have that kind of change requires all the elements that we've been speaking about now. And most importantly, it cannot be this kind of, we move into loggers and defensiveness and protective. We're being protectionist about our own interests. Well, and this kind of environmentalist versus unionist, that, as far as I'm concerned, Alison, that's rubbish. I'm really sorry. It worries me when we get into that space, that experience of ours in South Africa. If we did not have the unions, the civil society organizations, we had a mass democratic movement, then we had international solidarity added to that, we would never have won our freedom in South Africa. Okay, the only confession I have to make is we won our freedom. It was amazing. We struggled during that period. We won our political freedom, but then we didn't win our economic freedom because we adopted the same models as everybody else adopted. And so our growing inequality and poverty is related to that. So I think when we're planning the just transition, we really also need to know where we're going to. Where are we going to? It cannot be the same as usual. It is also about challenging the concept of jobs, about local communities and livelihoods, etc. All those discussions are up for grabs. So I think take your hat off as a unionist, as a civil society and an environmentalist, and actually put on the global hat, the common good hat, because this world needs much more solidarity with each other. We are going through horrible, horrible, horrible times, and climate's just going to make it worse. And as if humanity can't, and we're all human beings, can't rise to the occasion, then we really have no hope. So my hope is we've witnessed big change in the world. There's enough examples, and we just have to get our act together. So Tarcisio, you cannot have either or, as Assad says, everybody must be at the table. There's urgency and must be pushed forward. Can't take 15 years. I didn't realize the Australian thing took 15 to 20 years. So in a shorter period of time. So urgency is needed on top of everything else. Thanks.
Thank you, Tasneem. Rhoda.
Well, just final words, and actually, I think, Tasmin, you touched on the question that I was posed by Nemo, which I think was directly linked to the African continent. And actually, I think that you did take the right route. But I must say, in this sense, talking about developmental models that may be needed or are needed for African, whether we should really follow the current developmental trend or model, or should we adopt an alternative? I think there are two schools of thought here, where people or the South actually argue. I think I should be looking in this direction, so I speak into this microphone. There are two schools of thought here, where the first school of thought says, no, we should be allowed to pollute as much as we want to, because we have also the right for us to industrialize. And there is the second school of thought that says, actually, the opportunities that exist if we actually also adopt or follow alternative modes of production. And this is where we need to see what actually suits us and what is best for us, but then adopting or trying to implement homegrown policies that are in our interest. And this is what I think I have to emphasize on in this. I think the AU Vision 2063 speaks to this, and this is something that we really need to consider and actually bring on the table also in our discussions as a developing or as a global South. The question about migration, I think that was also answered. I won't touch too much on that, but then it actually brought to mind the need for us to focus on policy coherence, whereas in trying to develop our policies, we don't only need to look at developing climate policies or developing migration policies, but try to ensure synergies between policies to address questions such as the migration crisis, where we have a lot of climate refugees. And so in short, I think there is hope, actually. And if we look, and I speak from the development world or the South, if we are able to harness the opportunities that come within these discussions, there really is hope for us, and we really need to try to see how best we can harness on these. Thank you.
So friends, I hope you are aware that there are so many examples we need to call upon, and we have many challenges ahead. But indeed, a just transition is campaigning on refugees, political refugees, and what are called climate refugees is a part of the trade union platform. We don't have time to go into this more today. But indeed, a just transition will invest in jobs, in decent work, in opportunities in sectors which reduce carbon emissions and help communities adapt to climate change. A just transition will respect the contribution that workers in the fossil fuel industries have made to today's prosperity and provide them with income support to really provide opportunities in retraining and redeployment, as well as secure their pensions of older workers. A just transition will guarantee social protection and human rights. It will invest in community renewal to gain the hope and the trust of regions and townships and communities at the forefront of the energy transition and the industrial transformation or of climate impacts. A just transition will also support the innovation and technology sharing, both across the globe, to enable the rapid transformation of energy and of the manufacturing companies, along with other economic sectors. That includes issues around support for sectoral planning for transforming the megacities. We need to formalize the jobs associated with rescue and restoring communities and building resilience to climate disasters. And we need to have a just transition based on social dialogue with all the relevant parties, collective bargaining with workers and their unions for workplace change, resource productivity and skills development, with the monitoring of agreements which are public and legally enforceable. Friends, we have many, many challenges, but indeed, we want decent and green jobs on a living planet. Let's work together on making a just transition to be possible. Thank you for your presence today.
Great, thank you. Nice meeting you. Do you have a card? Do you have a card for you? Yeah. Yeah, I've done that before.